Okay, so in this presentation, I'll be addressing the big question, are we living in a simulated reality? And try to explore possible and plausible answers to the question. Now, we might be asking ourselves, what is the purpose? What is the importance of such a question? Why do we ask it? Is it a philosophical question? Is it an explorative one? Does it have any practical value? Or do we just ask it for mere entertainment? Well, in this particular session, I would like to use it with the aim of covering a little bit of all these purposes. So basically, going into the philosophical assumption and implications of the question, explore some ideas across both the sciences and also the mystic traditions. And at the same time, I would like to note that the question has an increasing practical value, all right? Because it is becoming more pertinent in today's context because we are facing more than ever before change and global crisis at an unprecedented rate. And all these changes, all these crises are forcing us in a way to review and rethink our fundamental understanding of ourselves and the nature of reality. In other words, our common sense view of the world, our map, our model of reality, especially our materialist model of reality, is not that adequate anymore. Okay, it's not sufficient. It's not bringing home the right answers. So when you compound that with the idea that we are advancing really fast in our technologies, and already we have with us, and over the next, I would say, decade or two, we're going to have more and more influence by technologies such as, for example, artificial intelligence, full immersion into augmented reality. Think about neural connection between the brain and computers, basically. And the future of the internet that includes things, so-called Internet of Things, big data, and sophisticated AI algorithms that make sense of that big data. So all these technologies are, and will even be more so, of game changers that will make us reconsider, probably even in a very fundamental way, our view on reality. Luckily, all this thing hasn't been dropped on our heads like, out of the blues and all of a sudden. Science fiction novels, such as, for instance, the blockbuster trilogy The Matrix, back in the 90s, and others, have been instrumental in seeding the idea in popular cultures and into the public's imagination, into the collective psyche. Moreover, the notion of a simulated reality and its cohorts, the holographic model of reality, for instance, are something that are taken also seriously within the academia, within the sciences. Okay. Now, when we discuss something like the possibility of a simulated reality, or even the nature of reality for that matter, one has to look into our sense perception, okay, into the subject, into the topic of perception and its limitation. Because the idea of a simulated reality, first and foremost, makes us ask questions and think about our perception and how reliable our knowledge of the world is. This is what in philosophy is called epistemology. It's the understanding of how we acquire knowledge and how reliable, how certain that knowledge is. Okay? So the question about the simulated reality makes us look first and foremost into how we acquire knowledge through our perception and how reliable is it. Okay? Now, the notions of humans living in a simulated reality, like in the Matrix movie, for instance, comes from a philosophical thought experiment called the brain and the vat argument, where the idea is something like this. If we were just brains in a jar, okay, in the lab of this crazy scientist, and our brain in this jar is connected to these powerful machines, computer machines, and sophisticated AI software. And all this is creating within the brain the simulation of our physical world. Basically, everything that we believe as being solid and real, our entire environment, our life, our world, would be nothing more than a simulation created by these sophisticated machines. And if that was the case in this hypothetical scenario, um, would it be possible for our sense perception to tell the difference between, um, or to understand, or to recognize, to realize that basically what we are experiencing, sorry, is a simulation? Okay, would there be telltale sign that would show us that basically what we are perceiving and experiencing is a simulation? So it begs the question. Now, the idea of the brain in a jar, brain in a vat argument came originally from the French philosopher René Descartes, who back in the 1600s was publishing his book called Meditation on First Philosophy. And throughout this book, Descartes was basically making this thought experiment. Okay, he was going through a skeptical thought experiment where the aim was to for him to try to understand whether he can get to the rock bottom of certainty and knowledge, whether there could be a way for us humans to acquire knowledge and be certain of it. Okay, so he started going through all the possible ways that we acquire knowledge, like, sense perception, and then he's saying, oh, but perception could be unreliable, it could be faulty, our reasoning could be skewed, and we could have a head injury or a trauma or a biological defect of some sort, so on and so forth, until he came to a point where he said, like even the whole notion of reality could basically be the manifestation of a trickster, of a demon who is making us believe that what we are perceiving is real. So that was the 1600s equivalent of the brain in a jar argument. That is where it is coming from. And so the whole point about this, about Descartes' thought experiment and about the brain in the vat argument, is that the reliability of our sense perception to know for certain whether we are living in a simulated reality or not is put into question. Our sense perception is not adequate enough, basically. But this whole notion basically causes an instinctive reaction, an unconscious reaction and resistance to the idea. And it's not hard to understand why, because we are biologically hardwired to make sense of the world through our five senses. Hence, what we call the common sense view of the world, right? Now, the idea that reality could be something different than it is met with skepticism, since we have kind of an inbuilt assumption in us that says, if I see this, if I see something, if I see the world in this way, then it must be so. Okay, there is a logical inference from saying, okay, I am seeing it this way, so it could not be different, it must be this way. And this is, in philosophy, is called the naive realist view of reality. Now, why am I mentioning this? I'm mentioning this first and foremost because the naive realist position is very, very common. Okay, it's not only like common in the academia and the sciences and in philosophy, but it's also very common as a lay concept, as it permeates through culture. The average man on the street, especially in our modern times, basically has this naive realist assumption somehow encoded in built in the way he sees the world. So the standard definition of naive realism is, and I quote, "In philosophy of mind, naive realism, also known as direct realism, common sense realism, or perceptual realism, is the idea that the five senses provide us with direct awareness of objects as they really are. Okay? Objects obey the laws of physics and retain all their properties whether or not there is anyone to observe them. They are composed of matter, occupy space, and have properties such as size, shape, texture, smell, taste, and color. that are usually perceived correctly. So that is the standard definition of naive realism. So when you condense that, when you summarize that, naive realism is based on these three very basic assumptions, which is the first is that our perception gives us direct access to things as they really are. So basically what it means is that what you are seeing is what there is, because your perception is reliable and you can access the world through your perception as it is. The second assumption is that objects exist independent of your perception of them. So whether you are observing them or measuring them, things are as they are, and they will remain as they are, whether you're looking that way or not, okay, whether you're observing it consciously or not. And the third and last assumption in naive realism is objects have intrinsic qualities, meaning that the qualities that we perceive in objects around us, we do so because those objects have intrinsically those qualities inherent in them. Okay. Now, before going into these three assumptions of naive realism and trying to understand basically not only alternative views of them, but how our knowledge, our present-day knowledge, can tell us something, can show us how, in fact, the idea of naive realism is, well, naive up to a certain point. So even just by looking at the limits of perception, the idea that our view of the world is through a very tiny perceptual window, okay? For instance, like in vision, in our sight, okay? The spectrum of visible light, okay? The spectrum of visible light, basically the only frequencies that we can perceive with our vision, with our eyes, is only a very, very, very tiny fragment. It's a tiny sliver, a slit, when compared to the whole broad spectrum of electromagnetic energies, okay? So what that says is that we are accessing, when it comes to vision, we are accessing the world only through a tiny, tiny fraction of it, okay? We are excluding a lot of the other frequencies, and this goes on for the other senses, for the other four senses. So our gateway to the world, our perception, is only limited to particular frequencies, to particular subsets, okay? It's excluding a lot of information, basically. And so the assumption would be, the idea would be that if we had to broaden that spectrum, if we had to increase those frequencies, what we see, what we perceive, what we access in the world would be far, far bigger, more broader, right? Now, to go into the first assumption of naive realism, okay, which says that we basically experience and perceive the world as it is, okay? The first thing that can be said regarding this is that our perception is heavily filtered and constructed. So rather than the naive realist idea that we are passive receivers of an objective world, like a CCTV camera would, okay, it's just there and it's just passively receiving signals, data, information from the world, okay, from the environment. We are not like that. We are much more complex than that. And our perception is a complex construction out of multiple layers of filters, okay? What this means is that we have a stack, multiple layers of filters, whether they are emotional filters, mental filters, and even physical filters, that help us color, shape, and construct the world around us, okay? So we see the world through these filters and we interpret it, we make sense of it, and we color it, so to speak, through these filters. Like, for instance, emotional filters, okay? Like, when you are going through a particular mood and you have a bad mood or a good mood, even that emotional position, that emotional um, feeling, just uh, interferes or influences basically how you see things. Okay, you might be in a very good mood, and all of a sudden the world lights up, and you interpret that stranger's smile in a different way that you would have if you were in a very, very bad mood and you just had an awful bad day. Mental filters. We know that our thoughts, beliefs, and also our state of well being greatly affects perception. For instance, stress narrows down awareness in a fit for survival. Okay, when you are highly stressed, you really, really narrow, the world closes in on you. You narrow your awareness. Okay, you are unaware more than usual of other things, of other cues, of other information, because you are in this survival mechanism. Basically, you are really, really focusing on survival, on a very, very narrow and particular feed and cues that you are getting from your environment. The opposite would be true when you are in a very highly relaxed state, and you would be accessing what are called the deep alpha brainwave states, which opens up your awareness and makes you more prone to make connection between facts and learn more easily and integrate information more easily. Um, we also see that beliefs and thought patterns are at any moment influencing our perception and its contents. Okay? Like, it's like saying you see it when you believe it rather than you believe it when you see it. Why? Because what you are really believing, all those thought patterns, those beliefs, those attitudes, basically construct um, the world around you. Okay, so they heavily influence what you are perceiving. Okay, um, and last but not least, physically and biologically, we are hardwired in a certain way that makes us see the world in a certain way. So, for example, as we saw before, we have a certain limited band of frequencies where we can access the world. Okay, where we can access external reality. For instance, like by aging, our sensory acuity might decrease, and that changes also what we can bring in, what we can perceive from our environments. Um, we are, biologically hardwired to see a certain field of view. Certain other animals or insects have a different field of view, or they can actually perceive through different frequencies, like infrared, for instance. Um, we can also, unfortunately, have certain physical impairments that also drastically alters our perception. So what we are saying here is that basically through these physical, mental, emotional filters, we are effectively, in a very fundamental way actually, creating the world around us. We are constructing it. It is a construct, okay? It is colored, it is interpreted, and it is, we're making sense of it heavily through these filters. Another point basically is the idea that we are not just passive um, observers of our external reality, but we interact with it, right? And rather than what the naive realists assume, that we are kind of like, like these cameras, and we are just standing there and receiving whatever is out there. We are more like very dynamic and going into these so-called feedback loops with our environment. Okay, and what this feedback loop is that basically our internal states, like once again our emotional states, our beliefs, our thought patterns, dictate to a large degree what we see, what we pick, what signals, what information, what data we pick out there. So basically, we are filtering in and out what comes in from the outside. Okay, there is gateway of perception, once again, that is heavily influenced by our perceptual filters, by our emotional filters. So we are filtering in and out information. At the same time, um, these um, these internal states change, right? They are subject to change as we learn, as we grow, as we expand, as we change our point of views. And when we change these internal states, it once again changes what we receive, what we pick from our environment. So there is this constant dynamic, this interaction going on between our internal states and our environment. Okay, there is this feedback loop. And it is dynamic, it is all the time changing as we learn, as we grow, as we enter into different contexts and situations. Okay, so it is very, very dynamic. Okay, it is not static, it is not passive. The Chilean biologists Humberto Maturana and Francisco Varela coined the term autopoietic systems. And they said, listen, we are autopoietic systems, meaning that we are, when you look into this idea from what is called the systems thinking perspective, we are complex systems, okay, that are able to self-create and self-organize ourselves. And we do so because we are constantly engaging in this feedback loop. We are intelligent, active agents. We are not just passive observers. Okay? We are not inanimate. We are deeply entrenched and engaged with an environment around us. So the nature of our perception is such that it is already pointing at how, contrary to what the naive realists assume, that we construct or simulate objective reality rather than just receive it passively. Now, the hard question is whether there is an objective reality at all that is completely independent of our perception of it. Okay. Since the dawn of quantum mechanics, almost a century ago, we have been slowly revising our idea of what makes objective reality. In the classical materialist view of science, there is, or it is assumed, that there is an objective reality independent of our observation, and that this independent objective reality is made up of matter, energy, and interactive forces. Now, experimentation and quantum theory over the last century started questioning the very foundation of this assumption. And most of you might have heard of the famous double slit experiment in quantum physics that essentially reveals the double nature of light. So light is seen as having this dual nature of both having wave properties and having particle properties. And this is kind of the central point, the takeaway from this experiment is that the results, meaning whether it's measured as having wave properties or particle properties, varies depending on whether it is being observed or not, whether it's being measured or not. So there is a lot to say about this, of course, and you can go in a lot of details, but what this is essentially saying is that our perception and conscious observation affects how reality behaves, at least at the quantum level as far as we know. So therefore, objective reality is no longer that independent as the classical view of science or the naive realist had us assume. And now that kind of questions the second basic assumption of naive realism, that there is an objective reality that is very and actually totally independent of our observation of it. And so what these experiments like the double slit experiment in quantum physics is showing is that ultimately this is not so, and that the conscious observer is pretty much part of the equation. So we start to come to the idea that perhaps the idea of a purely untainted objective reality, independent of us, as in the classical view of science, is perhaps just a narrative of our time. Perhaps it's a myth of our time. And as we expand and grow our knowledge, as we go deeper into the fundamental aspects and truths of reality, perhaps we start understanding that this was just knowledge that is just provisional. That we are changing it as we grow, as we expand our knowledge. Now, the third assumption of naive realism, that objects have intrinsic qualities of their own, is also highly questionable. You know, when you think about it, there is no such thing as redness out in the so-called objective world. Redness is just a quality or a format we give to a specific frequency. So for instance, you're looking at a red apple. Okay, the surface of the skin of the apple has a certain material molecular configuration that when the visible light frequencies hit the surface, it absorbs certain of those frequencies and emits back a particular frequency. Now, when that particular frequency hits our retina of our eyes and is processed through the optic nerve and the brain, it is interpreted. Okay, it gives it a certain format, and we perceive it. We process that. We feel this quality of redness. Okay, but the quality of redness is not intrinsic. It's not inherent in the actual apple itself. Okay, um, we are just biologically programmed, configured, okay, hardwired to interpret that particular frequency as the quality of redness. But that quality of redness could have been anything else. It could have been what we uh, collectively feel as blue, or we could have interpreted that as a sound, as in the case of the phenomena of synesthesia, for example, where the sense modalities are somehow crossed over. Okay, and you can hear a particular color, and you can actually see the hues of a particular note. Okay, so the brain is the mind is very malleable. Okay, and the idea that we see red coming from an apple is a format, is how we interpret a particular wave frequency. Okay, and when you go deeper into thinking about this, one starts thinking that perhaps what we call objective reality, okay, what we call external reality, meaning things as they are outside of our conscious observation or measurement of it, might ultimately be completely propertyless, qualityless. Okay, it would be kind of like more of try to imagine seeing interference patterns, wave patterns, like in a lake or a pool of water. When you're seeing all these waves interacting with each other, and perhaps objective reality is simply that. It's purely mathematical and qualityless. Okay, and that is something kind of like to ponder on. And from here, I would like to actually jump into a very interesting topic that is referred to as the holographic model of the universe, which might uncover some other views and perspective related to the question of living in a simulated reality. Now, some leading theoretical models in science that are best equipped in explaining a vast array of phenomena also point at the possibility of reality being a simulation, in the sense, however, of it being a projection of something else. Okay. Now, the first person to come up with the idea of the holographic model of the universe was the physicist David Bohm, who originally had proposed the model of the holographic model of the universe by cleverly using the analogy of the hologram to explain something very fundamental about reality. And this fundamental aspect of reality is that the information of the whole is unfolded within the parts. Now, to explain this basically, and why he was using the analogy of the hologram. Now, the hologram is a technology that we we have been using for quite some time on Earth, actually. Okay, it's not something, although we see it in science fiction movies, it's not that science fiction. Okay, um, but yeah, like in the science fiction movies, when you see this holographic projection of, let's say, a whole human being, basically what a hologram is a 3D projection of 2D information. So the hologram technology is basically try to imagine a holographic film or a holographic plate, okay, that contains the information of the whole image. And you put that photographic film in front of a laser at a certain angle, at a certain frequency. And what comes out at the other end is the three-dimensional projection of that image. Now, the very peculiar thing about a hologram is this, and this is why David Bohm is using this analogy. If you take that holographic film and you take a pair of scissors, you cut that film in half, and you put the photographic film in front of the laser again, the whole image still comes out. And you cut that in half again and in half again, and you keep on cutting it into as many pieces as you like. And when you put the bits and pieces in front of the laser again, the whole image still comes out. And the reason for that is because it follows what is called fractal geometry, whereas the pattern and information of the whole keeps on being repeated into the parts and the smaller parts and keep on going like that. And no matter how much you keep on zooming into the parts, you will always see the pattern and formation of the whole. So in short, and this is kind of like the weird thing about the holographic model, is that everything is in everything. Okay? Now, Bohm also talks about what he referred to as the implicate and explicit order. Okay? And this is where it starts becoming really interesting to the subject of simulated reality. The implicate order, according to Bohm, is like a universal field of information that contains all the information of the universe and its infinite quantum possibilities. Okay, it just contains everything. Some call this the quantum field, while in mysticism, for instance, it is often referred to as the Akasha, as the Akashic field or the Akashic records. It is like the holographic film, which contains all the information of the whole. Now, the physical universe we are part of, and everything that it contains, including ourselves, is the explicit order, which means it is just one projection out of this implicate order. Just like in the holographic projection, you are projecting an object in 3 dimensions out of a holographic film, out of a 2-dimensional film. Okay, and so the whole idea behind Bohm's holographic model is that we, the universe that we live in, is quite possibly a projection. Okay, and it's not just a projection, but it is a projection out of an infinite number of possible projections. Okay, and this is where it really becomes weird, and it almost becomes an insane notion to understand that we are living inside a holographic projection. And not only that, there is this kind of like weirdness behind the idea of holography and fractal geometry, is that the information of not just this universe, but any possible universe, any possible information that can exist is contained in everything. So on the tip of your fingernails, you have the information of the whole. And besides David Bohm and the holographic model of the universe, there were other theorists, and you know, most famously the likes of Leonard Susskind, who was a string theorist, and who, through studying black holes, basically also put forward um, a holographic model, okay, which basically says that it points at the very strong possibility that the black holes, but also the whole universe, are once again three-dimensional projections of two-dimensional information. And he looks into this when, after a decade or so of studying black holes, where he and other like-minded scientists came to the conclusion that the event horizon around a black hole, this kind of like two-dimensional film around the black hole, contains all the information that is within the black hole. So all the information inside the three-dimensional space of the black hole is contained within this two-dimensional space, this two-dimensional film. Now, the idea of the universe being a holographic projection is nothing new. It's not in the exclusive domain of science either. In ancient Eastern philosophy, for instance, and other mystic traditions, the idea of a holographic universe had already existed. A clear example of this is the story of Indra and his net, as we see in the Atharva Veda. Indra was a king deity who cast a net of pearls across the entire cosmos till infinity. Okay? And each of these pearls was placed in such a way as to reflect all the other pearls in the net. Okay? So each and every one of these pearls was reflecting on its surface, on its polished surface, all the other pearls that exist within the net. And so this is another way of saying that the information of the whole net, is also present in each and every part, the pearls. Okay? And this is basically what the holographic and fractal model is all about, which is a very, very interesting notion. Now, so we saw how modern science and ancient mysticism, science fiction, imagination, and a deeper look into how our perception works all point to a very strong possibility that our reality is a simulation, at least that it is a projection rather than just being as we perceive it to be. Now, a simulation is not always the correct word, okay, because it implies an intention to replicate something and make it appear as the original. What we are seeing here is the possibility of something far stronger than a simulation. For example, the idea that we are constructing and even creating an intricate world full of details by interacting with a qualityless world of mathematical patterns and energy waves at different frequencies is an astounding notion in itself. In truth, when you think about it, we are actually a little bit like the brain in the jar, not only the brain in the jar, but with the whole lab attached to it. Because we are receiving these electrical signals, these information from the outside world, and from it, by ourselves, we are creating a highly detailed world of forms, colors, sounds, and feelings. I mean, this is mind-bending and incredible by itself. And to add on top of this, we have some really wild claims, ancient and modern, about the nature of our universe being holographic, which for me at least is a stronger claim than than the idea of a simulated reality. Because a holographic universe means, among other things, that this thing we call the universe and which we share is a projection within a projection, and so on to infinity. And that on the tip of your fingernail, you contain much more than information of the entire universe. Okay. Now, after covering a little bit of these interesting topics and ideas, some people might want to ask whether there is someone or something behind this simulation, right? Or behind this projection. Surely if there is a projection, there must also be a projector. And this is for me is, popping the big philosophical questions of all time. Is there a creator? Who or what is behind this cosmic drama and why? And what other realities are behind this projected reality? Now, of course, it's not within the aim of this presentation to even touch upon such big philosophical questions. Not even a large series of presentations would even scratch the surface. But I am happy that through this presentation we have kind of like uncovered some very interesting ideas, and and show that basically the idea that we are living in a simulated reality is supported across a wide spectrum of human knowledge, from the ancient mystical traditions to hard science. And there is a vast spectrum of knowledge that we already have, we possess, and it is actually growing more and more, that supports the idea, and the possibility that we are living in a simulated reality, we are living in a projected reality, and that the nature of reality, um, you know, is so much more, so much deeper than our five senses, our common sense view of the world. Okay, our current paradigm and model of reality, which is still based pretty much on 19th century materialist sciences, is outdated. So there is much more to the nature of reality than we think. And just by asking the right questions and by pondering on some of these insights and some of these evidence that we have, um, we can really start to get a fuller, deeper understanding of ourselves and the world we live in. And all this is starting to be more relevant, and it has more practical value as we are entering into a new age, into a new world that we have never explored and experienced before. Okay? And so we should not be afraid, we should not be embarrassed, we should not be shy to ask these questions more and more. And, me personally, I'll be happy to discuss it anytime. It's a really fascinating, interesting topic, that I would never shy away from, and I would, happily engage with. So if you enjoyed this presentation as much as I did, if you want to engage in further discussion, drop me a comment. I'll be happy to, to discuss, to start a conversation. And, till the next time, thank you very much and see you soon.